The moment the sky went silent, the cabin lights dimmed so softly that at first no one noticed. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden jolt, no violent shake, no scream from the engines tearing through the sky. Just a subtle change, like the moment when music fades out in a room and people only realize the silence after it has already settled. Keanu Reeves sat by the window, his gaze resting on a stretch of endless cloud that looked like folded cotton under the morning sun. He wasn't thinking about fame or films or premieres. He rarely did on flights. Planes were the only places where time slowed down for him, where the world felt suspended, detached from expectation. He liked that. He liked the quiet anonymity of being just another passenger, another human sealed inside metal and hope, traveling from one place to another. Across the aisle, Sandra Bullock adjusted the blanket over her knees. She had her headphones in, but nothing was playing. She'd learned long ago that silence could be comforting if you allowed it to be. Her eyes were closed, but her mind was busy, replaying memories of rehearsals, scripts, conversations that never quite ended cleanly. She wasn't asleep, just resting in that fragile space between thought and calm. Neither of them knew that within minutes, silence would no longer feel peaceful. The first sign came from a child 3 rows back. "Mom," the boy whispered, not scared, just confused. "Why did it get quiet?" His mother smiled without looking up from her phone. "Planes do that sometimes, honey." But the boy kept staring out the window, his small fingers pressed to the glass. "No, I mean really quiet." Keanu noticed it then, the vibration beneath his feet, gone. The gentle hum that lived in the bones of every aircraft, absent. His eyes shifted from the clouds to the wing, where the engine sat unnaturally still, like a giant bird that had forgotten how to breathe. Sandra felt it too, even before she opened her eyes. There was a wrongness in the air, subtle but undeniable, like a held breath that had gone on too long. She pulled one ear cup away and listened. Nothing. No engine roar. No steady mechanical reassurance. Just the sound of air rushing past metal, thin and distant, like wind slipping through cracks in an old house. A murmur rippled through the cabin, not panic yet confusion. Questions spoken half out loud. Nervous laughs that tried too hard to sound normal. Keanu unbuckled his seatbelt slightly, leaning forward to get a better look down the aisle. Flight attendants stood frozen for a fraction of a second, exchanging looks that said far more than words ever could. Sandra's eyes met Keanu's across the aisle. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Both of them had lived long enough, seen enough, to recognize the moment when something ordinary turned into something else entirely. A chime sounded overhead. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice came through, calm but tight, like a rope pulled too far. "We're experiencing a temporary technical issue. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Temporary. That word landed heavily in the cabin. The plane dipped not sharply, but enough. A collective inhale swept through the passengers. Someone gasped. Someone laughed nervously. A woman near the back started praying under her breath, the words tumbling over each other in desperation. Sandra felt her heart pick up speed, not racing but alert. Fear had many forms, and this was the quiet kind, the kind that made you hyper-aware of everything. The smell of recycled air, the stiffness of the seat, the way your hands suddenly didn't know where to rest. Keanu placed his palms flat on his thighs, grounding himself. He had faced fictional danger on screen more times than he could count, but this was real in a way no script could ever replicate. Still, he didn't feel panic. He felt responsibility. An instinct older than logic whispered that in moments like this, calm wasn't just helpful, it was contagious. The plane dipped again, longer this time. A cry broke out somewhere to the left. The intercom clicked back on, but this time there was a pause before the captain spoke. That pause did more damage than any words could have. "We are working through the situation," the voice finally said. "Please follow crew instructions." Sandra closed her eyes for a brief second, not to escape, but to steady herself. When she opened them again, she saw fear spreading like ink in water. A businessman clutching his armrest. A teenager gripping her phone as if it could anchor her to the ground. Parents pulling children close, whispering reassurances they weren't sure they believed themselves. One of the flight attendants walked quickly down the aisle, her smile practiced but trembling at the edges. She stopped near Keanu, bending slightly. "Sir," she said quietly, "we need everyone to remain seated." Keanu nodded. "Of course, how can I help?" The question slipped out naturally, without thought. The attendant hesitated. For a moment the mask cracked. "Please," she said, barely above a whisper, "just stay calm." He gave her a steady look. "I am." Sandra watched the exchange, something tightening in her chest, not fear but recognition. She unbuckled her seatbelt just enough to turn sideways, facing the aisle. A sudden jolt sent a wave of screams through the cabin. This time there was no denying it. The engines were out. The plane was gliding. The cabin lights flickered, then steadied, dimmer than before. Oxygen masks didn't fall, not yet, but the threat hung in the air, unspoken and terrifying. A man shouted, "What's happening?" Another voice cracked, "Are we going down?" Sandra stood up. Not dramatically, not to draw attention. She simply rose, slow and deliberate, placing one hand on the seatback for balance. Heads turned toward her, not because she was famous, but because humans instinctively look toward whoever moves when danger freezes everyone else. "Please," she said, her voice clear, firm, and calm in a way that surprised even her. "Everyone stay seated. The crew is trained for this." A few people recognized her then. Whispers rippled, names spoken softly, but she didn't lean into that. She leaned into humanity. Keanu stood too, mirroring her calm, his presence solid, grounding. Together, they created something powerful without intending to, a center of gravity in a cabin drifting toward fear. Another announcement crackled through the speakers, less composed than before. "We've lost main engine power," the captain admitted. "We are attempting to reroute. Please remain calm." Remain calm. Easy words, heavy burden. Sandra felt her pulse in her throat, but she didn't let it reach her voice. She turned to a woman nearby who was shaking, tears streaming silently down her face. "Hey," Sandra said gently, kneeling beside her seat. "Look at me, breathe with me." The woman tried, failed, tried again. Keanu moved toward the back, speaking softly to a father struggling to soothe his child. "You're doing great," Keanu told him. "Kid's read us. If you stay calm, he will too." The father nodded, swallowing hard, clinging to the words like a lifeline. The plane dipped again, longer, steeper. This time, even the calmest faces cracked. Somewhere deep inside, fear finally knocked on Sandra's door. Not screaming, not demanding entry, just tapping, reminding her of mortality, of fragility, of how thin the line was between control and chaos. She didn't push it away. She acknowledged it. And then she chose something else. She chose courage. She chose kindness. She chose to stand. The intercom buzzed once more, this time with a different voice, a co-pilot younger, strained. "We may need assistance maintaining cabin order," he said carefully. "Please follow crew directions." Sandra looked at Keanu. Keanu looked back. In that glance lived years of shared history, trust built in quiet moments, an unspoken understanding that some situations didn't require permission. They nodded. The plane hurtled through open sky, powerless in the most literal sense of the word. And inside that falling metal shell, two people made a choice, not to be heroes, not to be legends, but to be human when it mattered most. Outside, the clouds thickened. Inside, fear waited. And this was only the beginning. When fear looked for a voice, the realization that the engines were no longer carrying them forward did not arrive all at once. It seeped into the cabin slowly, like cold through a cracked window, until every breath felt heavier and every sound sharper. The plane was still moving, still suspended between earth and sky, but it no longer felt alive. It felt like something coasting on borrowed time. Sandra could sense the shift in people before she heard it. Fear has a rhythm, and when it changes, the air itself seems to tighten. The murmurs had grown louder now, more urgent. Questions collided with one another, voices overlapping in confusion. Some passengers stared straight ahead, frozen in denial, while others craned their necks toward the front of the plane, as if answers might physically appear in the aisle. Keanu moved with a quiet steadiness that felt almost unreal under the circumstances. He wasn't rushing, wasn't trying to control anything beyond what he could reach. His presence alone seemed to slow people down. When he spoke, he kept his voice low, measured, grounded, the way someone speaks when they know that volume isn't strength but calm is. He paused beside an elderly man whose hands trembled uncontrollably, resting a reassuring palm on the seatback near him. not touching without permission, but close enough to say, "You're not alone." Sandra had returned to her feet, one hand braced against the overhead compartment as the plane subtly shifted again. Her balance held, but her heart jumped. She didn't let it show. She had learned over years of life and loss that panic spreads faster than truth, and right now, truth didn't need to be loud. It needed to be steady. A young flight attendant hurried past, her eyes wide despite the smile she was trying to maintain. Sandra caught her sleeve gently. "You're doing great," she said, her voice warm, intentional. "Everyone's watching you. They'll follow your lead." The attendant swallowed hard and nodded, drawing a deeper breath before continuing down the aisle. That single moment of reassurance changed the way she walked. Her shoulders squared just a little more. Her steps steadied. Another announcement came through the intercom, quieter now, stripped of formality. The captain spoke slowly, choosing each word with care, as if too much honesty might tip the balance toward chaos. He explained that they were gliding, that systems were still partially operational, that emergency protocols were in motion. He did not promise safety. He promised effort. Some passengers cried openly now, others prayed. A man near the window stared down at the clouds below, his lips moving without sound, his knuckles white as bone against the armrest. A teenage girl clutched her mother's sleeve, asking the same question over and over, each time softer than the last, until it dissolved into silence. Sandra knelt beside a row where two sisters sat holding hands, their eyes wide and glassy. She spoke to them not as a celebrity, not as someone elevated above fear, but as a woman who understood what it meant to be scared and still keep breathing. She told them to focus on small things, the rhythm of their breath, the warmth of their hands, the sound of her voice. She didn't promise that everything would be okay. She promised that they would face whatever came together. Keanu reached the back of the cabin just as another dip rocked the plane, sharper this time. A wave of panic surged and someone screamed. He raised his hands instinctively, not commanding, not demanding, just signaling calm. "It's okay," he said, though he didn't know if that was true. "Stay seated, breathe." It amazed him how desperately people wanted to believe someone who sounded certain, even when certainty didn't exist. In moments like this, authority didn't come from uniforms or titles. It came from presence. Inside, Keanu felt the weight of the situation pressing against him. He thought of impermanence, of how fragile all the things people cling to really are. He thought of loss, a companion he knew too well, and of how it had taught him that fear could either hollow you out or carve you open to compassion. He chose the latter, again and again. The cabin lights flickered once more, dimming further, and a hush fell over the passengers. The silence this time was heavier, almost reverent, as if everyone understood that shouting wouldn't help, that noise would only make the unknown louder. Sandra returned to her seat for a moment, not to rest but to anchor herself. Her hands shook now, just slightly, hidden against the fabric of her pants. She let them shake. Strength, she knew, was not the absence of fear, but the decision not to let fear dictate your actions. She inhaled deeply, filling her lungs, grounding herself in the simple miracle of breath. When she stood again, it was with renewed clarity. A man across the aisle looked at her, recognition finally dawning fully in his expression. You're Sandra Bullock," he said, his voice trembling, as if saying her name might somehow change the outcome. She smiled gently. "Right now," she replied, "I'm just another person on this plane with you." Those words mattered more than any reassurance about engines or altitude. They reminded people that they weren't spectators in a tragedy waiting to unfold. They were participants in a shared human moment, bound together by vulnerability. The intercom crackled again, this time with instructions from the crew. Brace positions were mentioned. Emergency procedures explained in calm, deliberate language. The words were familiar to frequent flyers, usually ignored, usually background noise. Now every syllable landed with weight. Keanu moved back toward the middle of the cabin, helping passengers understand what they were being told without adding technical detail, without feeding fear. He demonstrated slowly, deliberately, showing people how to position themselves, making eye contact, offering nods of encouragement. Each small action chipped away at the chaos, replacing it with structure. Outside, the clouds thinned, revealing glimpses of land far below. It felt both closer and impossibly distant. The plane continued its silent descent, gravity doing what engines no longer could. Sandra caught Keanu's eye again across the aisle. This time there was something new in their shared look, not just resolve but acceptance. They both understood that control was an illusion, that all they truly had was the present moment and the way they chose to show up in it. The cabin had changed. It wasn't calm, not truly, but it was quieter, more focused. Fear was still there, undeniable, but it no longer ruled unchecked. People were breathing together now, listening, holding hands, grounding themselves in connection rather than panic. The plane shuddered once more, and a collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Sandra felt her heart slam against her ribs, but she stayed standing, her posture open, her face composed. She spoke again, louder this time, not shouting, just clear. She reminded people to listen to the crew, to stay present, to focus on what they could control. Her words weren't poetic. They were practical, human, real. Keanu felt a strange sense of clarity settle over him. The fear hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something sharper, more purposeful. Whatever happened next, he knew this moment mattered, not because of survival alone, but because of how people treated each other when everything familiar was stripped away. As the ground slowly, terrifyingly drew nearer, the plane carried more than passengers through the sky. It carried stories, regrets, hopes, unfinished conversations. And within that fragile vessel, courage was no longer an abstract idea. It was alive, moving through the cabin in quiet acts of kindness, in steady voices, in hands reaching for other hands. No one knew yet how this would end. But they knew they were facing it together. And somewhere between fear and faith, between falling and holding on, something profound was beginning to take shape. Something that would stay with them long after the plane touched Earth, one way or another. When time began to move differently. Time stopped behaving normally somewhere between the last announcement and the next shudder of the plane. Seconds stretched into something elastic, heavy, as if the air itself had thickened. Inside the cabin, people were no longer counting minutes or miles. They were counting breaths, heartbeats, the small spaces between one moment and the next, hoping each one would not be the last. The plane glided lower now, and the reality of proximity pressed in on everyone. The land below was no longer an abstract blur. Shapes had definition, fields, winding roads, patches of water reflecting dull light. That closeness made fear sharper but also strangely grounding. This was no longer an idea of danger. It was something tangible, something human minds could finally grasp. Keanu felt the shift in his body before he fully understood it. His senses sharpened, every sound amplified, the creak of the fuselage, the soft sob of a woman a few rows away, the shallow breathing of a child clinging to a stuffed toy. He moved again through the aisle, slower now because speed felt wrong, because urgency could so easily tip into panic. He stopped beside a man who sat completely still, eyes fixed forward, his expression vacant in a way that worried Keanu more than visible fear. "Hey," Keanu said gently, crouching slightly so they were closer to eye level. "Stay with us." The man blinked, his focus snapping back with effort. "I can't feel my hands," he whispered. "That's okay," Keanu replied, calm as stone. "Put them on your knees, press down, feel the seat, you're here." The man did as he was told, nodding slowly as sensation returned. It wasn't a miracle, but it was enough to bring him back from the edge of dissociation, back into the shared reality of the cabin. Sandra remained near the front now, close enough to hear fragments of conversation from the cockpit through the partially open door. She didn't strain to listen. She didn't want details that wouldn't help. Instead, she focused on faces. Fear looked different on everyone. On some, it was loud and obvious, spilling out in tears or trembling. On others, it was quiet, buried deep behind clenched jaws and rigid posture. She met each expression with the same thing, steady eye contact, a presence that said, "I see you." A mother nearby struggled to keep her voice steady as she spoke to her daughter, promising things she couldn't guarantee. Sandra placed a hand lightly on the back of the woman's seat, grounding both of them. "She's watching how you breathe," Sandra said softly. "You're doing better than you think." The woman exhaled shakily, nodding, her shoulders lowering just a fraction. That fraction mattered. Another announcement came, shorter this time, stripped of reassurance and wrapped in urgency. The captain explained that they were attempting a controlled descent, that preparations were ongoing, that everyone needed to be ready. There was no drama in his voice, but the weight of his responsibility was unmistakable. This was not a man asking for hope. This was a man asking for trust. The cabin absorbed the message in silence. Keanu returned to his seat briefly, not because he needed rest, but because even strength required moments of stillness. He buckled in, placing his feet firmly on the floor, grounding himself again. He thought of how often people imagined courage as something loud and fearless, when in reality it was quiet, persistent, and often invisible. Courage was staying present when your mind begged you to flee. Sandra sat as well, her posture upright, composed. Her thoughts drifted unexpectedly to moments from her past, times when life had knocked the air from her lungs, when grief or loss had arrived uninvited and changed everything. She realized that those moments, painful as they were, had prepared her for this one, not in any practical sense, but emotionally. She had learned that fear did not have to erase compassion, that even in the worst moments, kindness could still be chosen. The plane jolted again, harder this time, and the sound that followed was raw and human, a collective gasp, then cries, then prayers spoken aloud without shame. The floor vibrated beneath their feet, and the wings groaned under stress. The illusion of smooth flight was gone entirely now, replaced by the undeniable reality of descent. Keanu unbuckled once more, despite the risk, moving instinctively toward a cluster of passengers whose panic threatened to spread. He spoke to them slowly, deliberately, reminding them of the crew's instructions, guiding them back into their seats. His voice never rose, never sharpened. It didn't need to. Calm was persuasive when fear was exhausted. Sandra stood again as well, her movements careful, measured. She felt fear surge anew in her chest, stronger this time, but she did not retreat from it. She addressed the cabin not with grand speeches, but with grounding reminders, focus on the present, on breathing, on following directions. She spoke as someone standing inside the same uncertainty, not above it. Outside, the horizon tilted. The plane banked slightly, adjusting its course. For a moment, the sun broke through the clouds, casting pale light across the cabin, illuminating faces wet with tears, hands clasped tightly together. The light felt almost cruel in its beauty, a reminder of everything fragile and precious. A child asked in a small, steady voice that cut through the noise, "Are we going to be okay?" No one answered immediately. Sandra looked toward the child, then toward his parents, whose eyes pleaded for certainty she could not give. She chose her words carefully, honoring the truth without surrendering hope. "We're doing everything we can," she said gently, "and we're doing it together." That answer did not promise survival, it promised solidarity, and somehow that was enough. Keanu felt something shift inside him then, something profound and quiet. He understood that whatever happened next, these moments would endure. The way people held each other, the way fear had softened into connection, the way strangers had become companions in vulnerability. The plane continued its descent, closer now, the details of the ground below unmistakable. The cabin grew quieter again, not from calm, but from focus. People adjusted into brace positions, whispered last words, squeezed hands. The air was thick with unspoken emotion, with love, regret, gratitude. Sandra lowered herself into her seat, bracing as instructed, her heart pounding but her mind clear. She closed her eyes briefly, not to escape, but to center herself, to honor the gravity of the moment. When she opened them again, she caught Keanu's gaze one last time across the aisle. There was no fear in that look. Only understanding. Only presence. The plane shuddered once more, the ground rushing closer, the outcome still uncertain. But inside the cabin, something extraordinary had already happened. In the face of helplessness, people had chosen humanity. In the absence of control, they had found meaning. And whatever came next, that choice would never be lost. When courage had no applause. The world outside the windows no longer looked distant or abstract. The ground had texture now, fields stitched together by thin roads, patches of trees standing like silent witnesses, water catching light in uneven flashes. The closeness made everything feel sharper, more final, and yet inside the cabin, something unexpected happened. Fear, which had dominated every breath moments earlier, began to lose its grip, not because the danger had passed, but because people had reached the limit of panic. Beyond that edge, there was only acceptance, focus, and a strange, fragile calm. The captain's voice returned, quieter than before, stripped of ceremony and authority, sounding now like a man carrying an unbearable weight with steady hands. He spoke of angles, of timing, of doing everything possible to guide the plane toward a survivable outcome. He did not use technical language. He spoke in human terms, and the cabin listened with a reverence usually reserved for final confessions. No one interrupted. No one shouted. The fear that had once demanded answers now understood that answers would not change what was coming. Keanu felt his body respond instinctively to the change in atmosphere. His breathing slowed. His shoulders relaxed just enough to conserve energy, as if every muscle understood the importance of remaining present. He looked around at the passengers near him. noticing details he might never have seen under ordinary circumstances. The way a man gently rested his forehead against the seat in front of him, eyes closed in quiet prayer. The way two strangers held hands without exchanging names. The way a young woman mouthed words into her phone without pressing record, speaking to someone she loved even if they would never hear it. Sandra noticed the same transformation. The cabin was no longer a place of chaos, but of resolve. People followed instructions now without resistance, not because they were unafraid, but because they understood that cooperation was their final act of agency. She moved carefully through the aisle one last time, not to instruct, but to witness, to offer presence where words would have been too much. She rested a hand briefly on a shoulder here, met a gaze there, grounding herself in the reality of shared humanity. She felt fear still deep and undeniable, but it had changed shape. It was no longer sharp and frantic. It was heavy, solemn, almost sacred. She allowed it to exist without fighting it, knowing that resisting it would only drain the strength she needed. In that acceptance, she found clarity. Whatever happened next, she would meet it fully awake, fully present. The plane trembled again, a long vibration that traveled through the cabin floor and into their bones. This time, no one screamed. There were gasps, yes, and tightened grips, but the collective response was restrained, focused. The crew moved with practiced urgency, voices low but firm, guiding everyone into final positions. Their professionalism, born of training and discipline, provided a fragile framework of order in a situation that threatened to unravel at any moment. Keanu returned to his seat, buckling in carefully, adjusting his posture as instructed. He glanced down at his hands, steady now, and felt a quiet gratitude for the strange path that had brought him here, for the lessons life had forced upon him long before this moment. Loss had taught him impermanence. Grief had taught him humility. And now those lessons allowed him to face uncertainty without collapse. Sandra settled into her seat as well, her back straight, her jaw set with determination rather than tension. Her thoughts drifted briefly to the people she loved, not with desperation, but with tenderness. She realized that in moments like this, love was not a desperate clinging to outcomes, but a deep appreciation for what already existed. She held that feeling close, letting it steady her. The cabin grew quieter still, the kind of quiet that comes not from peace but from focus. Outside, the land rose steadily to meet them, no longer a distant idea but an approaching reality. The plane adjusted its angle again, and the sound of air rushing over metal grew louder, more insistent, as if the sky itself were resisting what was about to happen. A flight attendant's voice trembled as she gave final instructions, but she finished them anyway, her courage evident not in perfection but in persistence. Sandra caught her eye and nodded, a small gesture of solidarity that seemed to strengthen the young woman's resolve. Keanu noticed it too, the way courage traveled silently between people, unacknowledged but powerful. There was no applause for any of this, no recognition, no cameras. Courage here was anonymous, quiet, almost invisible. It was the choice to breathe when fear demanded collapse. It was the decision to follow instructions even when hope felt thin. It was the willingness to be present for strangers without expecting anything in return. The plane dipped lower, and the angle of descent shifted again. Objects in the cabin rattled softly, a reminder of the forces at play beyond human control. Sandra felt her heart pound harder now, each beat echoing in her ears, but she did not flinch. She leaned forward into the brace position, her body aligned with intention, her mind focused on the moment unfolding rather than the outcome waiting at its end. Keanu did the same, grounding himself in physical reality, the pressure of the seatbelt, the firmness of the floor, the steady rhythm of his breath. He thought of nothing else. No future, no past, only now. The final announcement came, brief and unembellished. The captain thanked everyone for their cooperation. His voice wavered just slightly at the end, not from fear, but from the gravity of responsibility. It was the sound of a man who had given everything he had. As the plane continued its descent, the air inside felt charged, heavy with anticipation and unspoken emotion. People squeezed their eyes shut or stared straight ahead. Some whispered prayers. Others simply breathed, counting silently, anchoring themselves in the present. Sandra felt a profound stillness settle over her, a calm so deep it surprised her. It wasn't resignation. It was clarity. Whatever happened next, she knew she had shown up fully, offered what she could, stood where fear had tried to push her down. Keanu felt the same quiet certainty. In the absence of control, he had chosen compassion. In the face of uncertainty, he had chosen presence. Those choices mattered, regardless of the outcome. The ground was very close now, The moment they had all been moving toward, breath by breath, second by stretched second, was nearly upon them. And inside that falling plane, courage did not shout or demand recognition. It simply existed, steady, unyielding, and profoundly human, waiting to carry them into whatever came next. When everything came down to one moment, the descent reached a point where thought itself felt too slow to keep up with reality. The plane was no longer merely approaching the ground, it was committing to it. The air outside roared now, louder than fear, louder than prayer, louder than anything human voices could produce. It pressed against the aircraft with relentless force, and inside the cabin, every vibration carried the weight of inevitability. This was the threshold where anticipation ended and consequence began. Keanu felt the pressure first through his spine, a deep physical awareness that left no room for abstraction. His body responded instinctively, muscles tightening in coordination, breath steady despite the pounding of his heart. He was not thinking of survival in heroic terms. He was thinking of presence, of staying awake, of staying aware, of meeting the moment honestly. Around him, passengers clung to one another, foreheads pressed down, hands locked together as if connection itself could anchor them to the world. Sandra's awareness narrowed into something intensely focused, as though everything extraneous had fallen away. Sound blurred at the edges, leaving only the raw sensation of motion and gravity. She could feel the tension in the cabin like a living thing, thick and electric. Fear surged again, fierce and undeniable, but it did not overwhelm her. It sharpened her senses instead, pulling her fully into the now. She braced, grounded, aware of her breath moving in and out like a quiet metronome. The plane lurched suddenly, violently, and this time there was no restraint to the reaction. A wave of cries surged through the cabin, raw and instinctive, as the aircraft dropped faster than before. The impact had not yet come, but everyone felt it rushing toward them. Objects rattled loose, the structure groaning under forces it was never meant to endure without power. The sensation was not smooth. It was chaotic, turbulent, as if the sky itself were pushing back. Keanu heard someone calling out for help, a voice cracking under strain. Without lifting from his braced position, he reached sideways, grasping blindly until his hand found another. He squeezed once firmly, a wordless message of solidarity. The hand squeezed back, trembling but present. That small exchange carried more meaning than any speech could have. In that instant, fear was shared, and in sharing it, softened. Sandra felt the jolt ripple through her bones, a shock that stole her breath for a heartbeat too long. Pain flared briefly along her shoulder as the seatbelt tightened hard against her body. She welcomed the sensation, the sharp reminder that she was still here, still conscious, still part of this unfolding moment. Somewhere nearby, someone cried out a name, maybe a loved one, maybe a prayer. Sandra did not know which, and it did not matter. Both came from the same place. The crew's voices cut through the noise, strained but steady, urging everyone to hold position, to stay down, to brace. Their courage did not look like confidence now, it looked like endurance. They were not calm because they felt safe. They were calm because they refused to abandon their responsibility. That distinction mattered. Outside, the ground surged upward with terrifying speed. The angle shifted again, sharper, and the plane responded with a violent shudder that traveled from nose to tail. The sound that followed was not a single noise but a collision of forces, metal protesting, air screaming, gravity asserting its claim. Inside the cabin, time fractured. Moments no longer followed one another in sequence. They stacked, overlapped, pressed together until the present felt impossibly dense. Keanu's thoughts flickered briefly, not memories, not regrets, but gratitude. Gratitude for having loved, for having been loved, for having lived fully enough to meet this moment without bitterness. He did not cling to hope or surrender to despair. He simply allowed himself to be exactly where he was, trusting that whatever came next would come whether he resisted or not. Sandra felt a similar clarity wash over her, unexpected and profound. She was not thinking of fame or legacy or unfinished work. She was thinking of people, faces, voices, shared laughter, shared pain. She understood in that compressed instant that life was not measured by length but by depth, not by control but by connection. That realization steadied her more than any promise of safety ever could. Then came the impact. It was not a single event but a series of brutal, disorienting sensations. A violent jolt tore through the cabin, followed by a grinding force that threw bodies against restraints with bone-rattling intensity. Sound exploded, metal shrieking, glass cracking, voices crying out in shock and pain. The plane lurched sideways, then slammed again, harder this time, the force ripping breath from lungs, snapping heads forward despite braced positions. Keanu felt the world invert briefly, then snap back. Pain flared across his chest, sharp and immediate, but he remained conscious, anchored by sheer will and awareness. He heard shouting, then silence, then shouting again, fragmented and chaotic. Smoke filled the air, acrid and choking, stinging his eyes. He forced himself to breathe slowly, deliberately, fighting the instinct to panic. Sandra felt the impact as a crushing weight, followed by a sickening slide as the plane skidded across uneven ground. Her body jolted violently, her head snapping forward despite her position. Dizziness washed over her, threatening to pull her under, but she fought it, clinging to consciousness with stubborn resolve. She tasted blood, metallic and sharp, and focused on breathing through the pain. The motion finally slowed, grinding to a halt with a final, shuddering lurch that left the cabin eerily still. For a moment there was nothing. No movement, no sound, just the echo of what had happened hanging heavy in the air. Then reality rushed back in. Cries erupted, groans, shouts for help. The cabin filled with smoke and dust, visibility reduced to hazy shapes and flickering emergency lights. The smell of burned material mixed with fear and pain, overwhelming and disorienting. Keanu unbuckled himself carefully, moving slowly to avoid worsening his injuries. Pain flared again, but he pushed through it, scanning the cabin, calling out, his voice hoarse but firm. "If you can hear me, stay calm, check yourself first, then check the people next to you." His words cut through the chaos, not because they were authoritative, but because they were clear. Sandra struggled briefly with her seatbelt, her hands shaking from adrenaline and pain. She forced herself to slow down to focus and freed herself. Standing was difficult, but she managed, bracing against a seatback as she rose. Her head throbbed, her vision blurred, but she stayed upright, orienting herself amid the wreckage. They locked eyes across the shattered cabin, smoke swirling between them. They were alive. Around them others were stirring, crying, calling out names. The danger was not over, not by a long shot, but the worst moment had passed. Survival, fragile and uncertain, had begun. And in that broken, smoking cabin, courage took on a new form, not the courage to face impact, but the courage to stand up afterward and help others do the same. What rose after the fall? The silence after impact was not peaceful. It was stunned, fragile, as if the world itself needed a moment to understand what had just happened. Then the sounds returned, uneven, human, urgent. Groans cut through the haze. Someone cried out a name again and again, their voice hoarse with panic. Somewhere metal creaked as it settled, a reminder that nothing here was stable, not yet. Smoke hung low in the cabin, turning light into something pale and unreal, and every breath tasted sharp and burned the throat. Keanu stood amid the wreckage, disoriented but alert, his body aching in places he would only fully understand later. He forced his breathing to slow, grounding himself in the same way he had done before the impact, because panic now would cost precious time and clarity. He raised his voice just enough to be heard, speaking calmly, deliberately, reminding people to stay aware, to check themselves, to respond if they could. His words were not instructions in a technical sense. They were anchors, simple reminders that consciousness itself was power. Sandra moved carefully through the narrow space between seats, steadying herself against anything solid. Pain pulsed behind her eyes, and every movement sent sharp signals through her body, but she ignored them as best she could. She focused instead on faces, on voices, on the reality that survival had brought with it a new responsibility. Fear had not disappeared. It had transformed into urgency, into the understanding that what happened next mattered just as much as what had already occurred. A woman sat slumped forward, stunned, her breathing shallow and rapid. Sandra knelt beside her, speaking softly, coaxing her back into awareness, reminding her to breathe slowly to stay present. Nearby, a man struggled to free himself, his hands shaking too badly to work the buckle. Keanu moved toward him, steadying his hands, helping him regain enough control to release the restraints safely. Each small act felt monumental, not because it was dramatic, but because it restored a fragment of dignity and agency in a moment that had stripped both away. The cabin became a landscape of shared effort. People who minutes earlier had been strangers now leaned on one another, offering shoulders, hands, quiet reassurance. Pain and shock had a way of leveling everything, status, background, identity, until only humanity remained. Sandra noticed how voices softened when people spoke to one another, how patience replaced panic in subtle ways. The instinct to survive had expanded into the instinct to help. Smoke continued to drift, and the emergency lights cast long, trembling shadows across the cabin. Somewhere ahead, a crew member called out, her voice strained but steady, checking in, counting, making sure no one was left unheard. Sandra responded, her voice clear despite the ache in her chest, helping relay who needed attention, who could move, who needed reassurance more than anything else. It wasn't about taking charge. It was about staying connected. Keanu felt a wave of exhaustion threaten to pull him down, the delayed response of a body that had given everything it had. He leaned briefly against a seat, closing his eyes for a second, just long enough to gather himself. In that brief darkness, gratitude flooded him, gratitude for breath, for awareness, for the chance to stand here and matter to someone else. When he opened his eyes again, he pushed the fatigue aside and stepped forward once more. Outside the plane, sounds filtered in, distant, muted, unfamiliar. The world beyond the cabin was alive, moving, responding. That realization brought a fragile sense of hope, not loud or triumphant, but steady. Survival was no longer a question. Recovery was. Sandra helped guide a shaken passenger toward a more stable position, her movements careful, her words measured. She felt the tremor in her own hands now, the delayed release of adrenaline, and allowed it without judgment. Strength, she understood in this moment, did not mean being untouched by fear or pain. It meant continuing anyway, choosing presence over withdrawal. As minutes stretched on, the chaos slowly gave way to structure. People checked on one another repeatedly, asking the same questions, offering the same reassurances, as if repetition itself could rebuild a sense of order. Keanu found himself listening more than speaking now, absorbing stories that spilled out in fragments. Someone talking about a child they wanted to call, another whispering about a promise they thought they would never get the chance to keep. He listened without interruption, knowing that being heard was sometimes the first step back to steadiness. Sandra noticed how the cabin, broken and scarred as it was, had become something else entirely. It was no longer just a space of survival. It was a place of reckoning. People were confronting how close they had come to losing everything, and in that confrontation, something honest emerged. There were tears, yes, but also laughter, soft, incredulous laughter born of relief and disbelief. There were apologies exchanged between strangers, thank yous spoken with a depth that ordinary life rarely demanded. When Sandra and Keanu finally stood side by side again, smoke thinning around them, the exchange between them was quiet and unceremonious. No dramatic words passed between them. They didn't need to. What they shared was recognition, of fear faced, of responsibility carried, of humanity chosen when it would have been easier to retreat inward. They had not been heroes in the way stories often imagined. They had simply refused to disappear into themselves when others needed presence. As help arrived and voices from outside grew clearer, a new emotion settled over the cabin. Not celebration, not relief alone, but reflection. People looked at one another differently now, as if seeing more than faces, seeing resilience, vulnerability, and connection etched into every expression. The experience had stripped away pretense and left something raw and meaningful in its place. Sandra felt the weight of it settle in her chest, heavy but not unbearable. She knew this moment would stay with her, long after bruises faded and normal life resumed. It would live in the quiet choices she made, in the patience she offered, in the way she remembered that kindness was not a grand gesture, but a series of small decisions made under pressure. Keanu felt the same quiet certainty. Survival had given him nothing to boast about, nothing to claim. It had given him a reminder, one he would carry forward. That presence mattered, that calm mattered, that showing up for others in their most fragile moments was one of the truest forms of courage. The plane, broken and still, rested where it had come to rest. But inside the people who had endured its fall, something had risen. An understanding of resilience not as invincibility, but as connection, not as fearlessness, but as compassion in the presence of fear. And long after the smoke cleared and the echoes faded, that understanding would remain, quiet and enduring, a testament to what the human spirit could choose to be when everything else fell away.